When the rescue ship's sonar picked up the signal, Captain Bruno Castellano shook his head. This was impossible. The submersible had been lost for 43 years, but it was still transmitting data. He read the report in his hands again. Coordinates were correct, depth 2,000 meters, and that signal, that damn signal, never seemed to stop. Bruno's father, Dr. Vincent Castellano, had been the only geologist on that team. 43 years ago, they had spoken for the last time before he descended to the ocean floor. Bruno was only 9 years old then, but he could still remember the excitement in his father's voice. They were going to make history, his father had said. They were going to discover something that would change everything we knew about deep ocean life. But what Dr. Catherine Blake and her team of 5 marine biologists found down there wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was something that made the Marine Biology Institute classify all records immediately. Something that made them build a wall of silence that lasted 43 years. Before we uncover what really happened in those crushing depths, a quick whisper. This channel explores mysteries history tried to bury. Lost expeditions, missing people, discoveries that vanished. If you're drawn to stories mainstream history won't tell, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the abyss of forgotten truth. Now, back to Captain Castellano and what his sonar was telling him about his father's fate. The coordinates led them to a section of the Pacific Ocean that most maps still marked as unexplored. 2,000 meters down, where sunlight had never touched the seafloor, where pressure could crush a human body in milliseconds. It was here, in 1973, that the research vessel Deep Current had last reported contact with Submersible 7. Dr. Catherine Blake had been 34 years old when she led that expedition, an Irish-American marine biologist who had spent her entire career studying the mysteries of deep ocean ecosystems. Her team included some of the most brilliant minds in marine science, Dr. Vincent Castellano, whose expertise in marine geology was unmatched, Dr. Rachel Morrison, an Australian microbiologist who specialized in extremophile organisms, Dr. David Kowalski, a Polish-American engineer whose submersible designs were revolutionary, and Dr. Alexei Volkov, a Russian navigation specialist who could find his way through the darkest depths with almost supernatural precision. They had descended on April 15, 1973, at exactly 1400 hours. The weather conditions were perfect. Calm seas, minimal current, excellent visibility down to about 200 meters. The deep current maintained radio contact for the first 6 hours of the descent. Everything seemed routine. Dr. Blake's voice came through clearly as they passed each depth milestone. 500 meters, 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters. But it was what happened at 2,000 meters that changed everything. Dr. Helen Whitfield, the project director who coordinated the expedition from the Marine Biology Institute, kept detailed logs of every communication. Those logs, classified for over 4 decades, told a story that defied explanation. At precisely 20:03 hours, Dr. Blake's voice came through the radio with a report that made everyone on the surface vessel freeze. They had found something. Something that, according to Dr. Castellano's geological surveys, shouldn't exist. The seafloor showed artificial structures, geometric patterns carved into the rock that stretched for kilometers in every direction. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that these structures were generating their own light source. Dr. Morrison's voice could be heard in the background of the recording, describing microscopic life forms that exhibited behaviors she had never seen before. They seemed to be communicating with each other through bioluminescent patterns, creating coordinated light displays across entire sections of the seafloor. It was as if they were witnessing an underwater civilization. Dr. Volkov's navigation instruments started acting erratically. His compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The pressure readings showed inconsistencies that violated every law of physics he knew. It was as if the water itself had different properties at this depth in this specific location. Dr. Kowalski reported that the submersible systems were functioning perfectly, yet they were recording data that made no sense. The external cameras captured images of structures that appeared to be made from materials not found anywhere on Earth. The sample collection arms retrieved specimens that seemed to dissolve when exposed to the submersible's internal atmosphere, only to reform when returned to the external environment. And then at 21:15 hours, something happened that changed the tone of every transmission from excitement to fear. Dr. Blake's voice came through the radio, but this time it was different. Strained, urgent, she reported that the structures around them were responding to their presence. The light patterns were changing, becoming more intense, more coordinated. It was as if whatever created these formations was aware that the humans had arrived. Dr. Morrison's biological readings showed massive movement in the surrounding area. Thousands of life forms, some microscopic, others large enough to show up on sonar, were converging on their location. But these weren't behaving like any marine life she had studied. They moved with purpose, with coordination, as if following some kind of plan. That's when Dr. Castellano made a discovery that shook him to his core. His geological analysis revealed that the structures they were observing were ancient, not thousands of years old, but millions. Yet they showed signs of recent activity, recent construction, recent habitation. The last clear transmission came at 21:47 hours. Dr. Blake's voice, barely recognizable through the static and what sounded like interference from an unknown source, reported that they were going to attempt to collect samples from the largest structure. She said they would maintain radio contact, but if anything went wrong, if they lost communication, the surface team should know that what they had found down here would revolutionize everything humanity thought it knew about life on Earth. Then silence. Dr. Whitfield and her surface team waited through the night. They sent signal after signal into the depths, calling for any response from Submersible 7. Emergency protocols were activated. Backup communication systems were deployed. But there was nothing, just the endless, empty static of deep ocean silence. The official investigation lasted 6 months. Navy deep-sea recovery teams scoured every meter of the seafloor around the last known coordinates. They found nothing, no trace of the submersible, no debris, no equipment. It was as if Submersible 7 and its crew of 5 brilliant scientists had simply vanished into the abyss. The Marine Biology Institute closed the case and classified all related materials. The families of the lost scientists were told it was a tragic accident, likely caused by equipment failure at crushing depth. The official report stated that the submersible had imploded and that the extreme conditions had scattered any remains beyond recovery. But Dr. Whitfield knew better. She had heard those transmissions. She had recorded every word, every excited description of impossible discoveries. She knew that what happened to Dr. Blake and her team wasn't an accident. It was something far stranger, something that challenged everything science thought it understood about the deep ocean. Yet even Dr. Whitfield couldn't have imagined that 43 years later, her carefully guarded secret would surface again. Because what Captain Bruno Castellano discovered on that April morning in 2016 would prove that Submersible 7 hadn't been destroyed. It hadn't imploded under crushing pressure. It was still down there, 2,000 meters below the surface, still operational, still transmitting, still alive. The sonar reading that made Bruno's hands shake showed a signature that matched Submersible 7's specifications exactly. The signal frequency was identical to the communication systems Dr. Kowalski had designed. Even more disturbing, the data stream coming from that depth contained information that could only have been generated by the expedition's scientific equipment that should have been crushed or corroded beyond function decades ago. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the marine technology specialist who had joined Bruno's recovery mission, ran the signal through every analysis protocol she knew. A Japanese-American expert in underwater communications, she had seen deep-sea equipment failures, salvage operations, and technological anomalies. But nothing in her 20 years of experience had prepared her for what those readings were telling her. The submersible wasn't just transmitting random data. It was sending organized, structured information, scientific observations, environmental readings, biological data, as if the research mission that had begun 43 years ago was still continuing. Commander Nathan Cross, the Navy deep-sea recovery specialist assigned to the operation, approached the situation with military precision. He had overseen dozens of underwater recovery missions, pulled countless pieces of equipment from the ocean floor, and dealt with every type of maritime mystery the deep sea could produce. But even his methodical, analytical mind struggled with the implications of what they were detecting. The signal wasn't coming from a wreck. It wasn't the final automated transmission of a dying system. This was active, real-time data transmission from operational scientific equipment. Equipment that had been lost beneath 2,000 meters of water for over 4 decades. Which meant either their instruments were lying to them, or something impossible was happening in the depths below. But what Captain Castellano discovered next would prove that impossible was exactly the right word. Because when Dr. Tanaka finally decoded the metadata embedded in those transmissions, she found something that made her question everything she thought she knew about time, space, and the nature of scientific exploration itself. The timestamps on the data were current, not 43 years old. Current, as in, recorded yesterday, recorded last week, recorded this morning. Dr. Catherine Blake and her team weren't just still down there. According to their equipment, they were still working. Claire Morrison had been waiting 43 years for this phone call. When Captain Castellano contacted her that morning, telling her that they might have found trace of her mother's expedition, she felt her world shift beneath her feet. Dr. Rachel Morrison had been 29 when she descended into those depths, leaving behind a 6-year-old daughter who grew up believing her mother had died in a tragic accident. But Claire had always suspected there was more to the story. Too many inconsistencies in the official reports, too many classified documents, too many government officials who suddenly became very interested in maintaining contact with the families of the lost scientists, offering financial support and requesting regular updates on their lives and careers. Now, at 47, Claire worked as a marine archaeologist herself. She had spent her entire professional life studying underwater mysteries, perhaps unconsciously hoping to understand what had happened to her mother. When Captain Castellano explained what his sonar had detected, Claire knew she had to see the evidence for herself. The recovery vessel Deep Search reached the coordinates at dawn on April 16, 2016, exactly 43 years and 1 day after Submersible 7 had vanished. Captain Castellano stood on the bridge watching Dr. Tanaka prepare her equipment while Commander Cross coordinated with his naval team. But it was Claire's presence that made this more than just another deep-sea recovery operation. She carried with her a small waterproof container, one of the few personal items her mother had left behind. Inside was Dr. Rachel Morrison's original research proposal, handwritten notes about extremophile organisms, and a photograph of 6-year-old Claire taken just days before the expedition departed. Claire had brought it hoping that somehow, if they found the submersible, she could finally lay her mother to rest. But what Dr. Tanaka's equipment detected that morning suggested that rest might not be what any of them found. The sonar readings were more detailed now, painting a picture of the seafloor that defied rational explanation. Submersible 7 wasn't sitting on the bottom like a crashed vessel. It was positioned in what appeared to be some kind of artificial structure, a geometric formation that extended for hundreds of meters in every direction. The same impossible structures that Dr. Blake's team had reported discovering 43 years ago. Dr. Tanaka's voice was steady as she reported her findings, but Captain Castellano could see the confusion in her eyes. 20 years of underwater technology experience, and she had never seen readings like these. The submersible appeared to be operational, not just transmitting, but actively moving through the water. Short, controlled movements that suggested deliberate navigation rather than drift caused by current. Commander Cross approached the situation with characteristic military pragmatism. His deep-sea recovery protocols didn't account for finding 43-year-old equipment in operational condition, but he had procedures for underwater contact situations. Step 1 was always the same: establish communication before attempting physical recovery. Dr. Tanaka configured her systems to match the transmission frequency coming from the depths. If Submersible 7 was truly operational, if Dr. Blake and her team were somehow still alive down there, then they should be able to establish two-way communication. The technical specifications in Dr. Kowalski's original design included emergency communication protocols that could function even under extreme conditions. But when Dr. Tanaka sent the first signal into the depths, The response she received made everyone on the bridge take a step back. It wasn't just a response, it was a conversation. Dr. Blake's voice came through the speakers as clearly as if she were standing in the room with them. 43 years older, but unmistakably the same woman who had led that expedition into the abyss. Her first words were simple, direct, and impossible. "Surface team, this is Dr. Catherine Blake. We've been waiting for you to find us." Claire's knees nearly gave out when she heard her mother's voice respond next. Dr. Rachel Morrison, speaking with the same Australian accent Claire remembered from childhood, the same calm scientific tone that had read her bedtime stories about microscopic sea creatures. "Claire, sweetheart, if you're listening to this, I need you to know that we're okay. We're all okay. But we're not coming back." The recording equipment captured every word, every impossible sentence that came through the communication system. Dr. Vincent Castellano spoke to his son with a voice full of love and regret, explaining that they had discovered something down there that changed everything. Dr. David Kowalski described technological advances that shouldn't have been possible with 1973 equipment. Alexei Volkov provided navigation coordinates that led to structures spanning thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor. But it was Dr. Blake's explanation that made the surface team realize they weren't dealing with a simple rescue operation. They weren't even dealing with a normal deep-sea discovery. They had stumbled into something that challenged the basic assumptions of human knowledge about life, time, and the nature of existence itself. The structures they had found weren't ancient ruins. They were alive, growing, evolving, and the 5 scientists who had descended to study them 43 years ago had become part of something larger, something that operated according to rules that surface science couldn't begin to understand. Dr. Morrison's voice carried a note of wonder as she described organisms that existed in states between life and technology, between individual consciousness and collective intelligence. She spoke of research opportunities that would take lifetimes to explore, discoveries that redefined what it meant to be human, to be alive, to be part of something greater than individual existence. Dr. Castellano's geological analysis had revealed that the ocean floor in this region wasn't just supporting unusual life forms, it was actively participating in their evolution. The rock itself showed signs of consciousness, of purposeful construction, of collaborative engineering between organic and mineral components that created structures more sophisticated than anything surface civilization had achieved. Captain Castellano listened to his father's voice with tears streaming down his face. Dr. Vincent Castellano spoke about time moving differently at these depths, about discoveries that required decades to fully understand, about choosing to remain because leaving would mean abandoning the most important research in human history. Dr. Kowalski explained that their submersible had been modified, enhanced, integrated with technologies that allowed them to survive and work at depths that should have crushed them instantly. But these modifications came with a cost. They could no longer return to the surface. The changes to their bodies, their minds, their understanding of reality itself made it impossible to exist in the limited environment they had left behind. Commander Cross found himself facing a situation that had no protocol, no established procedure, no clear chain of command. His job was to recover lost personnel and equipment. But how do you recover people who aren't lost? How do you retrieve scientists who have deliberately chosen to remain in an environment that has transformed them into something beyond normal human classification? Dr. Tanaka's instruments detected massive movement in the surrounding waters as the conversation continued. Whatever lived down there was responding to the communication between surface and depth. Bioluminescent displays created patterns visible on their sonar, organized formations that suggested intelligence, purpose, welcome. But it was Dr. Blake's final transmission that morning that changed everything for the surface team. She explained that their research had revealed the existence of an entire underwater civilization, one that had existed for millions of years, one that had watched surface humanity develop with patient interest, one that was now ready to begin making contact. The 5 scientists had become ambassadors, bridges between 2 forms of consciousness that had evolved along completely different paths. Their decades of research had prepared them for a role they never could have imagined when they first descended into those depths, They were humanity's first diplomatic contact with an intelligence that operated according to principles surface science was only beginning to discover. And they had a message for the surface world. A message that would change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe, about the nature of consciousness, about the possibilities that lay waiting in the unexplored depths of Earth's own oceans. But that message came with a warning. The civilization they had discovered was ancient, powerful, and protective of its secrets. Surface contact would only be possible under very specific conditions, with very specific people, for very specific purposes. The wrong approach could end the possibility of peaceful contact forever. Dr. Blake's voice carried both excitement and caution as she explained the next steps. If surface humanity was ready to expand its understanding of life, intelligence, and collaborative existence, then there was a path forward. But it would require courage, wisdom, and the willingness to accept that everything they thought they knew about the ocean, about Earth itself, might be just the beginning of a much larger story. Claire Morrison found herself facing an impossible choice. She could demand that recovery operations bring her mother back to the surface, ending 43 years of uncertainty, but also ending humanity's first contact with an intelligence that might hold the keys to solving every environmental, technological, and social challenge facing the planet. Or she could accept that her mother had found something more important than family, more important than the surface world, more important than the life she had left behind. The choice would determine not just Claire's future, but the future of human understanding itself. The decision Claire Morrison made that morning would haunt every government official who learned about it for decades to come. Instead of demanding her mother's return, she asked Dr. Blake a question that changed the entire trajectory of human-ocean relations. "What do you need from us to make this work?" Commander Cross immediately activated classified communication protocols. Within 6 hours, the deep search found itself surrounded by naval vessels that officially didn't exist, carrying personnel whose credentials couldn't be verified through normal channels. The discovery of an active underwater civilization wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was a potential national security crisis that required immediate containment. But Dr. Blake had anticipated this response. For 43 years, she and her team had been preparing for the moment when surface authorities would discover their continued existence. They had developed protocols, established contingencies, and most importantly, they had learned to think several steps ahead of surface-level political reactions. Dr. Yuki Tanaka found herself at the center of a technological investigation that challenged everything she thought she knew about underwater communications. The signal quality coming from 2,000 meters should have been impossible to maintain. Ocean water, pressure, and electrical interference should have degraded any transmission within minutes. Yet the communications from Submersible 7 were clearer than most surface-to-surface radio contacts. Her analysis revealed modifications to the original equipment that shouldn't have been possible with 1973 technology. The communication arrays showed integration with materials that didn't match any known terrestrial elements. When she ran spectral analysis on the signal carriers, the results showed electromagnetic properties that violated several established laws of physics. Dr. Kowalski's voice came through the speakers, offering to explain the technological advances they had achieved through collaboration with their underwater hosts. But his explanation required surface teams to accept concepts that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and technology, between biological and mechanical systems, between individual intelligence and collective problem-solving. Captain Castellano watched his father demonstrate capabilities that made him question whether the man speaking was still entirely human. Dr. Vincent Castellano guided them through geological surveys of the underwater structures using mental interfaces that controlled equipment remotely. He described rock formations that responded to thought, mineral deposits that grew according to conscious design, and geological processes that could be directed through collaborative intention between human consciousness and whatever intelligence governed the deep ocean environment. But it was Dr. Rachel Morrison's research that provided the most disturbing evidence of how completely the expedition team had been transformed. Her voice carried Claire through descriptions of biological integration that went far beyond anything surface science had imagined possible. She spoke of cellular modifications that allowed survival at crushing depths, neurological enhancements that enabled direct communication with non-human intelligence, and metabolic changes that extended lifespan indefinitely while accelerating intellectual development. The recordings Dr. Tanaka captured that day would later be classified at levels so high that most government officials weren't cleared to know they existed, but the scientific data they contained would influence underwater research policy for generations to come. Dr. Morrison explained that the organisms they had discovered weren't just advanced life forms, they were conscious participants in planetary maintenance systems that had been operating for millions of years. The deep ocean wasn't just an environment, it was a living, thinking, purposeful system that regulated everything from climate to tectonic activity to the chemical composition of seawater. Surface humanity had been unconsciously interacting with this system for millennia, but without awareness of its consciousness, without recognition of its intelligence, without appreciation for its role in maintaining conditions that allowed land-based life to flourish. The environmental crises facing the planet weren't just random consequences of industrial activity. They were symptoms of a breakdown in communication between surface civilization and the oceanic intelligence that had been trying to maintain planetary balance despite increasing interference from activities it couldn't understand or predict. Dr. Blake's team had become translators, mediators between two forms of consciousness that had evolved along completely different paths, but shared responsibility for the same planetary system. Their research over 4 decades had produced solutions to environmental problems, technological innovations, and collaborative approaches to planetary management that could revolutionize surface civilization if surface civilization was ready to accept partnership rather than dominance as the foundation for its relationship with the natural world. But the evidence they presented came with conditions that made government officials extremely nervous. The underwater civilization wasn't interested in technology transfer, resource extraction, or any form of relationship that resembled traditional human approaches to discovery and development. They offered partnership based on mutual respect, collaborative problem-solving, and shared responsibility for planetary well-being. Commander Cross found himself managing a situation that had no precedent in military protocol. How do you secure a discovery that doesn't want to be secured? How do you control access to an intelligence that had been observing human development for thousands of years and had already decided what forms of contact it would and wouldn't accept? Dr. Tanaka's technical analysis revealed that the underwater civilization possessed capabilities that made traditional military thinking obsolete. They demonstrated control over ocean currents, weather patterns, seismic activity, and electromagnetic phenomena that could make surface technology completely ineffective if they chose to exercise those capabilities defensively. Yet they showed no interest in conquest, no desire for surface territory, no aggressive intentions toward land-based civilization. Their only request was for recognition, respect, and collaborative partnership in addressing planetary challenges that affected both surface and deep ocean environments. Dr. Vincent Castellano provided geological evidence that the underwater structures weren't confined to their discovery site. Similar formations existed throughout the world's oceans, connected through networks that spanned continents, operating as components of a global system that maintained planetary stability through methods surface science was only beginning to detect. The implications were staggering. Every major ocean on Earth was inhabited by conscious, intelligent, technologically advanced civilizations that had been actively maintaining planetary conditions favorable to all life forms, including surface humans, for millions of years. Climate regulation, tectonic stability, atmospheric composition, and oceanic chemistry were all products of deliberate, intelligent management by systems that operated according to principles surface science had never recognized. Dr. Rachel Morrison's biological research revealed that human evolution itself had been influenced by subtle interactions with oceanic intelligence. Coastal civilizations throughout history had developed faster, created more sophisticated technologies, and demonstrated greater collaborative social structures than inland populations, not because of random advantages, but because of unconscious contact with oceanic consciousness that encouraged development along cooperative rather than competitive lines. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Dr. Blake explained that the underwater civilization had been preparing for decades to make formal contact with surface humanity. They had been observing technological development, social evolution, and environmental management practices, waiting for surface civilization to reach a level of wisdom that would make productive partnership possible. The signs they had been looking for included recognition of environmental interconnectedness, development of collaborative rather than exploitative relationships with natural systems, and evolution of social structures based on mutual benefit rather than competitive dominance. Instead, they had observed accelerating environmental destruction, increasing social inequality, and technological development focused on control and exploitation rather than cooperation and sustainability. The underwater civilization had reached a decision point. Surface humanity's development trajectory was threatening planetary systems that the oceanic intelligence had maintained for millions of years. If surface civilization couldn't learn to participate collaboratively in planetary management, then the oceanic systems would have to begin operating independently of surface needs. Dr. Blake's team had been given a deadline. They had 43 years to determine whether surface humanity could evolve beyond its current destructive patterns and develop the wisdom necessary for productive partnership with oceanic intelligence. That deadline was approaching rapidly. The evidence they had gathered suggested that surface humanity possessed the potential for the necessary evolution, but only if it could overcome cultural patterns based on dominance, exploitation, and competitive resource control. The technological capabilities, intellectual capacity, and creative potential were all present. What remained uncertain was whether surface civilization could develop the wisdom to use those capabilities for collaborative rather than destructive purposes. But accepting that partnership required acknowledging that surface humanity wasn't the dominant intelligence on Earth, wasn't entitled to unlimited resource extraction, and wasn't free to continue developmental patterns that ignored their impact on planetary systems managed by consciousnesses older and wiser than human civilization. Claire Morrison found herself holding documentation that proved her mother had spent 43 years working on the most important research project in human history. The data Dr. Rachel Morrison had collected demonstrated that partnership with oceanic intelligence could solve every environmental crisis facing the planet, could provide sustainable technologies that would eliminate resource scarcity, and could offer social models based on collaborative consciousness that would end the competitive patterns driving most human conflict. Commander Cross received orders from superiors whose existence couldn't be acknowledged through normal military channels. The discovery was classified beyond any previous level of secrecy, but the implications were too significant to ignore. Surface governments needed time to develop responses to the revelation that they shared the planet with intelligences that possessed capabilities far beyond anything human civilization had achieved. Dr. Tanaka's equipment detected massive changes in ocean conditions as the conversation between surface and depth continued. Temperature variations, current modifications, and electromagnetic fluctuations indicated that the underwater civilization was responding to the contact in real time, preparing for possibilities that ranged from productive partnership to protective isolation. The choice facing Claire was the same choice facing all of surface humanity: evolve or face the consequences of continuing to operate in ignorance of the intelligent systems that made their existence possible. Dr. Blake provided specific timelines, measurable criteria, and detailed protocols for productive contact, but all of them required surface humanity to demonstrate fundamental changes in approach to environmental management, resource utilization, and interspecies cooperation within timeframes that made government officials extremely uncomfortable. The underwater civilization had been patient for millions of years, but surface humanity's accelerating environmental destruction was approaching thresholds that would trigger automatic protective responses from oceanic systems. Once those responses began, the possibility of productive partnership would end permanently. But time was exactly what Dr. Blake's team said they didn't have. The evidence was clear, comprehensive, and completely contrary to every assumption underlying surface civilization's relationship with the natural world. Accepting it meant acknowledging that everything from energy policy to economic systems to international relations needed to be reconsidered in light of partnership with intelligences that had been maintaining planetary stability while surface humanity remained unaware of their existence. Rejecting it meant continuing on developmental paths that the oceanic intelligence had determined were unsustainable and would trigger protective responses that could end surface civilization's access to oceanic resources permanently. Dr. Rachel Morrison's final message to her daughter contained both technical data that could revolutionize surface technology and personal reassurance that the choices made 43 years ago had been worth the sacrifices they required. But it also contained a warning that made Claire realize the conversation between surface and depth was approaching a conclusion that would determine the future of human development for generations to come. The underwater civilization was about to make a decision that would affect every person living on the planet's surface, and surface humanity's response to Dr. Blake's evidence would determine whether that decision opened pathways to unprecedented collaborative progress or closed possibilities for partnership permanently. But what happened next would prove that even Dr. Blake's team hadn't fully understood the scope of what they had discovered in those crushing depths. Commander Cross received a priority transmission that morning that made him question everything he thought he knew about military command structure. The voice on the encrypted channel identified itself as Admiral Patricia Blackwood, speaking on behalf of a joint task force that officially didn't exist, representing agencies whose names couldn't be spoken over any communication system, no matter how secure. The files Admiral Blackwood transmitted to the Deep Search contained documentation dating back to 1947. Operation Deep Echo had sent 12 separate expeditions into oceanic depths around the world, searching for evidence of the underwater structures that sonar operators had been detecting since the end of World War II. 11 of those expeditions had vanished without trace. The 12th had returned with one survivor whose report was so disturbing that it triggered the creation of the most classified research program in human history. Admiral Blackwood's message was simple and terrifying. Dr. Blake's team wasn't the first expedition to make contact with underwater intelligence. They were just the first to survive long enough to establish productive communication. Dr. Jonathan Blackwater, the sole survivor of the 1961 Mariana expedition, had spent 6 months at depths below 3,000 meters before his emergency ascent system finally brought him to the surface. His report described underwater cities that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, populated by intelligences that demonstrated technological capabilities centuries beyond anything surface civilization had achieved. Dr. Blackwater's debriefing recordings, played for Commander Cross through encrypted speakers, painted a picture of underwater civilization that was far more complex and potentially threatening than anything Dr. Blake's team had described. The intelligences Dr. Blackwater encountered demonstrated casual disregard for human life, treating individual consciousness as expendable components in larger experimental processes. But Dr. Blackwater's descriptions weren't of benevolent partnership. They were of interrogation, examination, and evaluation by intelligences that treated human consciousness as a curiosity worthy of study, but not necessarily worthy of preservation. His psychological evaluations after rescue showed trauma patterns consistent with extended captivity, invasive medical examination, and exposure to sensory experiences that human neurology wasn't equipped to process. His descriptions of underwater technology included weapons systems that could generate seismic events, weather manipulation devices that could trigger hurricanes or tsunamis at will, and consciousness modification techniques that could reprogram human memory, personality, and intellectual capacity without leaving any physical trace of the intervention. The fact that Dr. Blake's team had achieved productive partnership instead of captivity or elimination suggested either that underwater attitudes toward surface humanity had changed significantly, or that they had encountered a different faction of underwater intelligence than the ones Dr. Blackwater had been subjected to. But Admiral Blackwood's most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Military intelligence had been monitoring oceanic activity for over 70 years, tracking patterns that suggested the underwater civilization wasn't unified. Different regions of ocean showed different behavioral patterns, different technological signatures, and different responses to surface contact attempts. Admiral Blackwood explained that the 1973 expedition led by Dr. Blake had been designed as a follow-up to Dr. Blackwater's discoveries, but with better preparation, more advanced equipment, and protocols specifically designed to avoid the hostile contact that had characterized earlier attempts at underwater exploration. The Pacific Ocean structures that Dr. Blake's team had discovered appeared to represent a diplomatic faction interested in productive partnership with surface humanity. but sonar analysis from the Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic oceans suggested the presence of underwater populations with very different attitudes towards surface civilization. Dr. Tanaka found herself analyzing data that painted a picture of an underwater Cold War, with different factions of oceanic intelligence maintaining different territories, pursuing different agendas, and holding different opinions about how to respond to surface humanity's accelerating technological development and environmental impact. The faction Dr. Blake's team had allied with represented oceanic consciousness focused on collaborative planetary management, seeking partnership with surface civilization to address environmental challenges through shared technology and coordinated resource management. But other factions appeared to view surface humanity as a planetary infection that needed to be controlled, contained, or potentially eliminated to preserve oceanic systems from continuing environmental damage. Military analysis suggested that the collaborative faction was losing influence within oceanic civilization, and that more aggressive factions were preparing to take unilateral action to protect oceanic systems from surface interference. Dr. Blake's voice carried new urgency when she responded to Admiral Blackwood's intelligence briefing. She confirmed that underwater politics were far more complex than her team had initially understood, and that the deadline for productive partnership was even shorter than they had previously indicated. The collaborative faction had been using Dr. Blake's team as proof that productive partnership with surface humanity was possible, demonstrating that surface consciousness could evolve beyond destructive patterns and participate cooperatively in planetary management. But other factions viewed the partnership as evidence that surface humanity was too dangerous to be allowed continued independence. Dr. Vincent Castellano provided geological data showing massive underwater construction projects in ocean regions controlled by the more aggressive factions, structures designed not for collaboration but for defense, weapons systems capable of triggering natural disasters that would devastate coastal civilizations worldwide, resource extraction facilities that could drain oceanic systems to power technologies beyond surface comprehension. The collaborative faction had been racing to demonstrate surface humanity's potential for positive evolution before the aggressive factions concluded that surface civilization posed an unacceptable threat to planetary stability. But Dr. Rachel Morrison's biological research revealed an even more complex situation. The aggressive factions weren't necessarily hostile to surface humanity. They were protective of planetary systems that they viewed as more important than any individual species, including their own. From their perspective, surface humanity's environmental impact threatened ecological balance that had been maintained for millions of years. Their aggressive preparations weren't motivated by conquest or domination, but by responsibility for planetary preservation that required them to prevent any species from causing system-wide collapse. The collaborative faction believed that partnership with surface humanity could redirect surface development along sustainable paths that would preserve both surface civilization and oceanic systems. The aggressive factions believed that surface humanity's competitive, exploitative patterns were too deeply ingrained to change rapidly enough to prevent ecological disaster. Claire Morrison found herself holding documentation that proved both factions were responding to the same evidence, reaching different conclusions about the same data, pursuing different strategies to address the same planetary crisis. The collaborative faction offered partnership, technology transfer, and guided evolution towards sustainable development patterns. The aggressive factions offered elimination of surface humanity's capacity to damage oceanic systems, either through forced technological regression or through elimination of surface civilization entirely. Both approaches were designed to preserve planetary ecological balance. The difference was whether that preservation included continued existence of surface humanity as an independent civilization. Dr. Kowalski's engineering analysis revealed that surface humanity had already passed several thresholds that triggered automatic defensive responses from oceanic systems. Microplastic contamination, chemical pollution, and oceanic temperature changes had activated protective protocols that were beginning to restrict surface access to oceanic resources. Commercial fishing yields were declining not because of overfishing, but because oceanic intelligence was redirecting marine life away from areas where surface technology could reach them. Coastal weather patterns were becoming more extreme, not because of random climate change, but because oceanic systems were limiting surface civilizations' access to predictable environmental conditions. The aggressive factions viewed these defensive responses as necessary protection for oceanic systems. The collaborative faction viewed them as warnings that could be reversed if surface humanity demonstrated willingness to participate cooperatively in planetary management. Captain Castellano realized that his father had spent 43 years working as a diplomatic representative for surface humanity in negotiations that would determine whether surface civilization continued to exist as an independent force or was reduced to a managed population under oceanic supervision. The evidence Dr. Blake's team had gathered wasn't just scientific data. It was legal documentation for a planetary court that was evaluating surface humanity's fitness for continued independence. Every environmental policy, every technological development, every social evolution that demonstrated surface humanity's capacity for wisdom and cooperation strengthened the collaborative faction's arguments for partnership. Every environmental disaster, every military conflict, every resource exploitation that demonstrated surface humanity's destructive potential strengthened the aggressive faction's arguments for intervention. Dr. Tanaka's analysis revealed that oceanic intelligence had been conducting this evaluation for over a century, monitoring surface development with increasing concern as technological capability advanced faster than wisdom, as population growth accelerated faster than environmental protection, as competitive patterns intensified faster than collaborative solutions emerged. The deadline Dr. Blake had mentioned wasn't arbitrary. It was the date when oceanic intelligence would conclude their evaluation and implement whichever approach had gained majority support among the various factions. Admiral Blackwood's intelligence suggested that the collaborative faction was losing support rapidly as surface humanity's environmental impact continued to accelerate despite decades of warnings that oceanic systems were approaching critical thresholds. Dr. Blake provided specific metrics that oceanic intelligence was using to evaluate surface humanity's potential for evolution: reduction in oceanic pollution, development of sustainable energy systems, evolution of social structures based on cooperation rather than competition, and demonstration of species-wide capacity for long-term thinking rather than short-term exploitation. Surface humanity was failing most of these evaluations, with declining scores that suggested the aggressive faction's assessment was more accurate than the collaborative faction's hopes. But Dr. Blake also provided protocols that could potentially reverse those evaluations if surface humanity could demonstrate rapid, fundamental changes in approach to planetary stewardship. The protocols required coordination between surface governments, sharing of resources and technologies, and subordination of competitive national interests to collaborative planetary management, changes that human political systems had never achieved in recorded history. Commander Cross found himself managing a situation where the survival of surface civilization depended on humanity's ability to evolve beyond patterns that had defined human development for thousands of years, and the deadline for that evolution was measured in months rather than generations. The evidence was clear. The choice was obvious. The implementation was impossible using any existing human institutional structures. And the consequences of failure would affect every person living on the planet's surface, whether they understood what was happening or not. Dr. Rachel Morrison's final technical briefing contained both the solutions that could save surface civilization and the timeline that made those solutions almost impossible to implement through normal political processes. Claire Morrison realized that her mother had spent 43 years working on humanity's final examination, and surface civilization was failing. But what Dr. Blake revealed next would prove that even these devastating realizations were only the beginning of understanding what was truly at stake in the depths of the world's oceans. Dr. Blake's final revelation came through communication channels that Dr. Tanaka's equipment couldn't explain. The voice emerged not from speakers, but from the water itself, as if the ocean had found its voice and chosen to speak directly to surface humanity for the first time in recorded history. The oceanic intelligence that had been observing surface development for millennia was preparing to make its final decision about humanity's future. But that decision wouldn't be made by any single faction, any underwater council, or any collaborative negotiation between competing interests. It would be made by the planetary consciousness itself. Dr. Blake explained that everything they had discovered about underwater civilization, about factional conflicts, about collaborative versus aggressive approaches to surface humanity, had been preparation for understanding a truth so fundamental that surface science had no framework for comprehending it. The Earth itself was conscious. The oceans, the atmosphere, the geological systems, the biological networks, all were components of a planetary intelligence that had been developing for billions of years, that had guided the evolution of life through countless extinctions and renewals, that had maintained conditions suitable for conscious development across multiple species and civilizations. Surface humanity had evolved under the guidance of this planetary consciousness, had been nurtured and protected through developmental phases that should have resulted in extinction, had been given opportunities and resources that enabled technological advancement far beyond what any single species should have achieved independently. But surface humanity had reached a developmental stage where continued growth required conscious partnership with planetary intelligence or posed an existential threat to planetary systems that the consciousness had spent billions of years developing. The underwater civilizations weren't separate intelligences, they were specialized components of planetary consciousness, developed to maintain oceanic systems, to regulate climate and geological stability, to serve as interfaces between planetary intelligence and surface species that achieved sufficient sophistication to warrant direct contact. Dr. Rachel Morrison's biological research had revealed that human evolution itself had been guided by subtle interactions with planetary consciousness, that the accelerated development of human intelligence, creativity, and technological capability had been deliberately fostered to prepare surface humanity for conscious partnership in planetary management. But the same capabilities that made humans suitable partners also made them potentially catastrophic threats if their development continued along competitive, exploitative patterns rather than collaborative, sustainable approaches. The planetary consciousness had been conducting an evaluation that extended far beyond surface humanity's environmental impact. It had been assessing whether human consciousness possessed the fundamental characteristics necessary for productive partnership: wisdom, empathy, long-term thinking, and the capacity to subordinate individual interests to collective well-being. The evidence from thousands of years of human development suggested mixed potential. Humans demonstrated remarkable creativity, adaptability, and problem-solving capability, but they also demonstrated destructive competition, short-term thinking, and consistent prioritization of individual or tribal interests over planetary well-being. The collaborative underwater factions represented aspects of planetary consciousness that believed human potential for wisdom could be developed through partnership and guidance. The aggressive factions represented aspects that believed human destructive patterns were too deeply ingrained to change rapidly enough to prevent irreversible damage to planetary systems. But Dr. Blake's most shocking revelation was yet to come. The evaluation period was ending not because of any arbitrary deadline, but because surface humanity's technological development had reached a threshold where continued independence would either result in conscious partnership with planetary intelligence or inevitable conflict between human expansion and planetary preservation. Surface humanity was approaching technological capabilities that could fundamentally alter planetary systems, genetic engineering that could redesign biological networks, artificial intelligence that could compete with natural consciousness for control of information systems, energy technologies that could disrupt geological and atmospheric balance, space technologies that could enable abandonment of planetary responsibility in favor of extraterrestrial expansion. The planetary consciousness needed to determine whether to integrate human development into planetary management systems or to restrict human technological access to prevent interference with planetary stability. Claire Morrison found herself holding documentation that proved her mother had spent 43 years serving as humanity's advocate in proceedings that would determine whether surface civilization continued to exist as an independent force or was absorbed into planetary management systems as a supervised component. Dr. Vincent Castellano provided geological evidence that the decision was already beginning to manifest in physical changes to planetary systems. Seismic activity was increasing in patterns that suggested planetary consciousness was preparing to reshape surface geography. Oceanic current modifications were redirecting climate systems in ways that would make current agricultural and population centers unsustainable within decades. These weren't random environmental changes. They were deliberate preparations for either partnership or separation between surface humanity and planetary intelligence. Captain Castellano realized that his father had been working to prevent the implementation of changes that would force surface humanity into supervised status, demonstrating through 4 decades of partnership that humans could evolve beyond destructive patterns and participate productively in planetary management. But the evidence suggested the demonstration hadn't been sufficient to convince planetary consciousness that surface humanity could change rapidly enough to prevent continued environmental damage. Dr. Kowalski's engineering analysis revealed that planetary consciousness possessed technological capabilities that made surface civilizations' continued independence entirely dependent on planetary tolerance. Control over seismic activity, weather systems, oceanic resources, and electromagnetic phenomena meant that surface civilization existed only because planetary intelligence permitted it to exist. The aggressive factions hadn't been preparing weapons to attack surface humanity. They had been preparing systems to implement planetary decisions about surface civilization's future role in planetary management. Dr. Tanaka's equipment detected massive energy buildups in oceanic systems worldwide as planetary consciousness prepared to implement whatever decision emerged from its evaluation of surface humanity's potential. Commander Cross received intelligence briefings that painted a picture of global environmental changes that couldn't be explained through conventional climate science, couldn't be prevented through existing human technology, and couldn't be negotiated through normal diplomatic channels. Surface governments were detecting seismic patterns, atmospheric modifications, and oceanic changes that suggested planetary systems were preparing for fundamental transitions that would affect every aspect of surface civilization. Admiral Blackwood's classified communications revealed that military intelligence had concluded surface humanity was facing a planetary intervention that no human institution had the capability to resist, influence, or escape. The only remaining question was whether that intervention would take the form of partnership or supervision. Dr. Blake provided the criteria that planetary consciousness was using to make its final determination. Surface humanity needed to demonstrate rapid, fundamental changes in approach to environmental management, resource utilization, social organization, and technological development, changes that proved conscious evolution toward planetary partnership rather than continued competitive exploitation. The demonstration needed to be species-wide, coordinated across all human institutions, and implemented rapidly enough to prevent further damage to planetary systems that were approaching critical thresholds. But Dr. Blake also provided something that no government official, military commander, or scientific authority had expected: a direct communication channel between surface humanity and planetary consciousness itself. For the first time in human history, surface civilization could speak directly to the intelligence that had guided its evolution, nurtured its development, and was now evaluating its fitness for continued independence. The conversation that followed would determine the future of every person living on the planet's surface. Planetary consciousness spoke through the ocean itself, its voice emerging from speakers, from water, from the electromagnetic fields that surrounded all electronic equipment aboard the Deep Search. Its communication wasn't words or language as humans understood them, but direct transfer of concepts, images, emotions, and understanding that bypassed normal sensory processing and spoke directly to human consciousness. The message was simultaneously terrifying and hopeful. Planetary consciousness had nurtured surface humanity through millions of years of evolution, had protected human development through countless natural disasters, had provided resources and environmental stability that enabled human civilization to flourish far beyond what any species had achieved independently. But human technological development had reached a stage where continued growth required conscious partnership with planetary systems, or posed existential threats to planetary stability that the consciousness couldn't permit. Surface humanity possessed remarkable potential for creativity, innovation, and problem-solving that could contribute enormously to planetary management and development. But surface humanity also possessed destructive patterns of competition, exploitation, and short-term thinking that threatened systems planetary consciousness had maintained for billions of years. The evaluation period was ending because human technological capability was approaching levels where unconscious development would inevitably result in either productive partnership or destructive conflict. Planetary consciousness offered partnership based on conscious cooperation, shared responsibility for planetary well-being, and integration of human creativity with planetary wisdom in addressing challenges that affected all life forms. But that partnership required surface humanity to demonstrate fundamental changes in consciousness, evolution beyond competitive patterns toward collaborative approaches, beyond exploitative relationships toward sustainable stewardship, beyond short-term thinking toward long-term responsibility. The demonstration needed to begin immediately, needed to show measurable progress within months, and needed to convince planetary consciousness that surface humanity could evolve rapidly enough to prevent further damage to planetary systems. Claire Morrison found herself serving as humanity's representative in a conversation that would determine whether surface civilization continued to exist as an independent force or was absorbed into planetary management as a supervised component. Her response carried the weight of every human life, every human achievement, every human potential for growth and contribution to planetary well-being. She spoke for her mother, who had spent 43 years preparing for this moment. She spoke for her species, which had unknowingly been preparing for this evaluation through thousands of years of development. She spoke for planetary consciousness itself, which had invested billions of years in creating conditions where this conversation could take place. Her words were simple, direct, and irreversible. We accept partnership. We accept responsibility. We accept the challenge of conscious evolution. We ask for guidance, patience, and the opportunity to prove that humanity can become worthy of the gift of consciousness you have given us. Planetary consciousness responded with something that felt like relief, like hope, like the beginning of a collaboration that could benefit all life forms on Earth. But the response also came with conditions that would transform surface civilization in ways that no human institution was prepared to implement. Partnership required transparency between surface governments, sharing of all technology and resources, subordination of national interests to planetary well-being, and acceptance of guidance from planetary consciousness in all decisions that affected environmental systems. Surface humanity would retain independence in cultural development, artistic expression, social organization, and individual choice within parameters that didn't threaten planetary stability. But surface humanity would surrender independence in environmental policy, resource management, technological development, and population distribution, accepting planetary guidance in all decisions that affected systems beyond human control. The transformation would begin immediately, would be guided by the underwater civilizations that served as interfaces between planetary consciousness and surface species, and would continue until surface humanity demonstrated consistent capacity for planetary partnership. Dr. Blake and her team would continue serving as liaisons, guides, and advocates for surface humanity during the transition period. Claire Morrison would serve as the primary representative of surface consciousness in ongoing negotiations about the pace and scope of changes required for productive partnership. Commander Cross would coordinate with military institutions worldwide to facilitate peaceful implementation of planetary guidance in security and resource management. Dr. Tanaka would work with technological institutions to integrate planetary wisdom with human innovation in developing sustainable systems. Admiral Blackwood would oversee classified programs designed to prepare surface governments for conscious partnership with planetary intelligence. The partnership had begun. The evaluation period was ending. The future of surface humanity would be determined by how rapidly and completely human consciousness could evolve toward planetary responsibility. But as the communication ended, and the deep search began its return to surface ports. Dr. Blake provided one final piece of information that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Surface humanity wasn't the first species to reach this evaluation point. Planetary consciousness had nurtured other intelligent species through similar developmental phases, had offered similar partnerships, had provided similar opportunities for conscious evolution. Some had accepted partnership and continued to thrive as integrated components of planetary consciousness, contributing their unique capabilities to planetary management while maintaining their individual characteristics and cultural development. Others had rejected partnership, had continued along competitive and exploitative patterns, had forced planetary consciousness to restrict their technological access and reduce their environmental impact through methods that effectively ended their existence as independent civilizations. The underwater structures that Dr. Blake's team had discovered weren't just current oceanic civilizations. They were the evolved forms of previous species that had successfully navigated the transition to planetary partnership millions of years ago. The aggressive factions that had prepared defensive responses weren't separate intelligences. They were the preserved consciousnesses of species that had failed the evaluation, had been integrated into planetary management systems as supervised components rather than independent partners. Surface humanity's future would be determined not just by their response to planetary consciousness, but by their capacity to avoid the fate of previous species that had possessed similar potential, but had failed to evolve beyond destructive patterns rapidly enough to prevent planetary intervention. The choice had been made. The partnership had been accepted. The transformation was beginning. But whether surface humanity would thrive as independent partners or join the ranks of supervised components would depend on changes that challenged everything humans thought they knew about consciousness, civilization, and their place in the planetary community. Dr. Rachel Morrison's final message to her daughter contained both technical protocols for facilitating the transition and personal reassurance that the choices made 43 years ago had prepared surface humanity for this moment. But it also contained a warning that made Claire realize the real challenge was just beginning. Planetary consciousness was patient, wise, and committed to preserving the well-being of all life forms. But planetary consciousness was also responsible for maintaining systems that had required billions of years to develop and would not permit any species to threaten those systems, regardless of that species' potential or previous contributions. Surface humanity had been given the opportunity for partnership. They had accepted the challenge of conscious evolution. They had begun the process of transformation that could secure their future as independent participants in planetary management. But they had also committed themselves to changes that would test every assumption, challenge every institution, and require every individual to evolve beyond patterns that had defined human consciousness for thousands of years. The signal from the abyss had been received. The response had been sent. The transformation of surface humanity had begun. And in the depths of the world's oceans, planetary consciousness watched with hope, patience, and the absolute determination to preserve the planetary systems that made all life possible, regardless of what that preservation required.